Hi, this is Angelo. Go back to Grumpy Old IT Guy. That's right, you heard me, the Grumpy Old IT Guy. And welcome to my Grumpy podcast, Creating a Database. Now, this is the second podcast in the beginning TSQL podcast series. And each podcast has a demo or two, so pay attention, guys. And by the way, there'll be two other series of podcasts, which I hope you'll find useful and helpful. There'll be the intermediate TSQL podcasts, which cover functions, stored procedures, and more. And then there's the advanced TSQL podcasts, and these cover analytical and statistical functions and other interesting topics. Now, after taking the series, you'll be able to perform basic queries associated with an TSQL developer. Here's a little grumpy comment: these podcasts will only cover the basics. So please look to my full 2020 Grumpy University for in-depth courses on these topics. Oh yeah, and here's a little alert. Did you look at my tool podcasts? These are very important. Please check them out because they'll show you how to install SQL Server and SQL Server Management Studios and other tools that you'll need on your path to becoming a TSQL or SQL Server BI Stack data architect. Okay, let's get going. Okay, by now you're probably asking, who is this grumpy old IT guy anyway? Well, that would be me. I'm a published author and data architect with over 30 years of experience in BI, data architecture, data warehousing, and data modeling. And before that, I was an electrical engineer, believe it or not. In the last 10 years, I've also participated in several large-scale master data and data quality initiatives. And to support these, I've achieved CIMP certification in master data and data quality. Now, I have to admit I love the Microsoft BI Stack, and I've been using SQL Server for more years I care to mention. Now, remember SQL Server 2000? Yep, I'm dating myself. I can just hear the moans and groans. And by the way, BI stands for Business Intelligence, if you've never heard of that acronym. And lastly, I hold a master's degree in computer science from New York Polytechnic University and a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, way back when Pratt Institute had an engineering program. Yep, Pratt Institute and Polytech in good old Brooklyn, USA. And yeah, those were the days, I have to admit. I had a great time, I learned a lot, and I met a lot of great people. Oh yeah, and here's a little comment. Yes, applause. And now I'm the founder and president of GrumpyOldITGuy.com. So get ready to learn the grumpy way. Okay, so what are we going to learn in this podcast? Well, here's a grumpy comment. We're only going to look at creating, altering, and dropping databases in this podcast, okay? These are part of a language called DDL commands. So we're going to use SSMS to create and drop databases. Now, DDL stands for Data Declaration Language, which is a subset of TSQL. And there's also DDL commands for altering a database, adding security, and other important data objects, which I'll discuss in my fall Grumpy University courses. And by the way, did I mention that a database is a collection of tables, views, stored procedures, functions, and security? Stored procedures and functions, by the way, are like little programs, and I'm going to have separate podcasts for each. And there's also another type of a little programming module called a trigger. And yes, there'll be a podcast for that. So that's what a database is. Okay, so let's get started. Now, there's two methods that we can use to create a database. Now, we can either use tools available in Object Explorer, which is part of the SQL Server Management Studio application. And recall in our prior podcast we covered that. And ultimately, we can use TSQL DDL commands. Now, by right-clicking on the database folder in Object Explorer and selecting New Database, we are presented with a dialog box that allows us to enter the main parameters required to create the database. And here they are. There's the logical name. You supply the logical name of a data file used to store the data, and also the logical name of the log file that's used to log transactions. Then you identify the file type of the data in the log files, then something called the file group. Now the name of the container that identifies data files for a database is called a file group. You can have one or more file groups. The default file group is called primary. Then there's the initial size, auto growth, and maximum size parameters of each of the data files. Next is the physical path, the complete physical folder path and name of each data and log file. And finally, the file name, the physical file name of the file. Now, if the physical file name is not supplied, it uses the logical name that you typed in earlier. File names end with an extension of MDF, which stands for main data file, or NDF, which stands for the next data file. So you create a primary file, probably call it primary.mdf, and then any other data file after that, you just end with NDF, all right? So that's if multiple data files are required, which is usually the case. At a minimum, you want the primary data file, and then you want at least one data file. And then you're going to, of course, have a separate data file for the log. And lastly, it's good practice to end log file names with either TRN for transaction or log. Okay, so let's proceed with our first demo and create a database with SQL Server Management Studio. Okay, let's bring up SQL Server Management Studio. There it is. I've got 3 instances of SQL Server running simultaneously, and I'm going to pick this last one, Grumpy 2019 I2 for instance 2. Now I want to create a simple database with SSMS. I'm going to call it test. So let me see if I have a test folder. I don't remember if I have a test folder on my D drive. So here we are. Here's our second instance here. Right over here. And I have only one folder, and that's going to be used for the SQL Server instance. So I'm going to create a folder called test, T-E-S-T, all right, and I'm going to click on it so I can copy the full physical path as text. All right, and I'm going to create a new database. There should be no databases here except the system databases. So I'll right-click on databases, new database, and there's our nice little dialog box. That's what we used to call it in the old days. Might want to call it a panel now, but anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm going to call the database test. All right, notice how the logical name automatically fills in. It's a test for the rows data. And then there's test underscore log for log. I'm going to, just going to make it, let's see, 800 megabytes for the primary data file and 80 for the log. I am going to change the path here. I'm going to paste the path name that I had copied earlier. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing here. So we should be all right. Now the file name, I'm going to call it test.mdf. And the log, I'm just going to call it test.log. How's that? And I am going to add an extra file. I can do that with SQL Server Management Studio in this panel. Just click on Add. Let me just update the path there by pasting. Oops, no, that's not what I wanted to do. Ouch. So I can just copy it from here, and I can paste it here. This time, nice and easy paste. Okay, we're good there. I'm going to call this test data underscore 1. Okay, this is our main data file, if you will, for the data, because we're going to be using that first logical file test that's in the primary file group. Sorry. Now we don't want this in the primary file group. We want it in a new file group. All right, so I'm going to drag this little dialog box that appeared on my other screen, and I'm just going to call this test data underscore file group. Okay, and I'm going to click to make it the default. Click on OK, and we just need to add a name here. If I don't add a name, it'll just use the logical name. So I'll just call this test data underscore 1.ndf. So we should be good to go. Small file, small database, I should say. 800 for the primary data file. Oh, let's make this also 800, and let's make the log. I'm sorry, the log will make 100. That sounds more reasonable. And this new data file will also make 800. So that's really all that there's to it. I'll just click on OK. And this shouldn't take too long because it's a small database, but we'll fast forward. And that's it, it completed. So let's refresh our databases folder here. And actually there's the test database right there. There's really nothing in it. And I'll right click on the test database to look at the properties. And they should reflect what we typed in that prior panel to create the database. So the general panel has the name of the database, the status, the owner, the date created, right, the size, the number of users, in this case 4. And that means 4 users can connect simultaneously. You can go in and change it. Let's see at the file groups. There's that test underscore data underscore FG file group. And notice that the default checkbox there is clicked, or checked, I should say. And there's our files, right? There's the information we typed in earlier, right? All the different logical file names, the file groups, the sizes, the physical path. All right, so if we now go and look at that physical path for test, we'll see the test data file, we'll see the primary test file, and then we'll see the log file. Right, so let's go back here again. I'm sorry, to D. Let's go to that instance, the data I2. There's the test folder, and there's those files. I just had to orient myself. I have quite a lot of databases here and files. So that's how you create a database with SQL Server Management Studio, specifically Object Explorer. Just click on OK. And let's get back to our clip. Okay, topic 2, create database with TSQL. Now, creating a database with TSQL DDL commands uses the same parameters we supplied with the Create Database tool in Object Explorer. And we just include them in the DDL TSQL code. Now, I have to admit, I recall that in our demo, or in our prior clip, I should say, and the demo, I didn't say anything about max size and file growth. So I'm going to talk about those in this clip, and they apply to creating a database with SSMS also. So here's a little grumpy tip. Now, it's a good practice to create a separate file group for data. So in other words, do not use the primary file group, because that's used for internal database system tables, so you don't want to mix them up. But let's take a look at this clip. So I'm going to start from the top of this logic, if you will, and work my way down. Now, creating a database, you use the create database keyword, supply it with the name of a database, in this case customer. There's something called containment equals to none, right? Just set it to none. What that means is that the user ID, if you will, that was used to create the database was derived from the Windows user ID. In other words, at the server level, when you log into Windows, you have certain user ID and passwords, and you can basically use them when you're creating a database. Alternately, you can create a a user ID in SQL Server only, right? So you don't see that at the operating system level. So in that case, the containment would not be set to none. So we'll just leave it at none, which is the default. So now you have the words on primary. So between parentheses, you have those familiar parameters that we talked about, namely the logical name of the file, which would be customer_sales. There's the full path, // SQL data / customer, that's the folder path, and then primary.mdf, an initial size of 41,920 kilobytes. And here's a new parameter that I didn't discuss. It is in that Object Explorer window when you create the database there, and I didn't again mention it, so I apologize. But max size is where you can set the maximum size of the database. In this case, it's unlimited. And then what do you do when you run out of space, right? When that initial size of the 41,920 kilobytes is eaten up? Well, there's that file growth parameter, and we set it to 65,536 kilobytes. So that means that when you run out of space, it'll be increased by that amount. And then you proceed to create another file group called customer data, and again a set of parentheses, and then the name, the file name, and those size parameters for the new data file. Right here, we're putting it in a path called SQL data inventory. All right, so apparently there's going to be inventory data associated with a customer. And then there's finally the log. There it is, customer_sales_log within a set of parentheses. So that's pretty much the DDL that you would use to create a database. And by the way, you can also create file groups and files for indexes. So in very, very, very large databases, you want to separate not only the files, but maybe the indexes into separate drives and dedicate file groups for them. Now here's a way of not doing it, all right? Notice that I only have one file group, the primary, and it's got all the parameters that I discussed. So what this means is when you create a production table, if you will, it'll be created in this file group, okay? So you definitely want to add one or more other file groups and one or more other files. So here's not to do it. And well, there's that grumpy tip, right? It's good practice to create a separate file group for data. So please remember this, very important. In my early days, I actually violated this rule, and I got called out by the managers of the operations area, and they were totally right. It's a very bad way of creating a database. Okay, let's go to our second demo and create a database with DDL. Okay, let's bring up SQL Server Management Studio, and yeah, going for coffee, keep up the good work. So guess Grumpy will be back after the demo. Okay, here's SQL Server Management Studio. So here's a review. So how not to do this? I'm not even going to bother creating this database because it has only one file group, the primary file group. There's the create database command. I'm calling it organization bad. But actually, you know what? Let me create it. Let me switch focus here. I'm going to switch focus to the SQL Server instance. So I'm going to go to connection, change connections. Okay, I'm doing it on purpose so you can see how to change connections in case you have multiple instances of SQL Server running. So I'm going to go to the SQL Express instance and connect. And I'm going to go to my folder, and I'm going to go to the D drive. There's my SQL Express data folder. Okay, I have organization underscore V2. So let's make another one called organization bad. Excuse me, organization underscore bad. And like before, let's double click so we can copy the address as text. let's go here and, well, actually, I already have it in here. Let me just double check. I'll put a comment. That's how you do comments, by the way. And yes, the SQL Express data organization bad. So we're all set. So let's create this database just for practice. This is not how to do it, by the way. So while it's cranking away, the primary file group, the initial size is 520 kilobytes. The maximum size is unlimited, so it'll just keep growing and growing. And each file growth increment will be 64 kilobytes. We can see it finished. And then the same thing for the log. It's the logical name organization underscore log. And then the file name, again, the full path on that D drive. And then organization underscore bad underscore log dot LDF. So you can use TRN for transaction as an extension, or LOG for log, or even LDF, log data file. That makes sense, right? I forget where I saw that. It was probably Microsoft documentation. But anyway, you know, use an extension that you like. You can use anything you like. And there you see the size, max size, and file growth parameters. All right, not much to say here. So let's actually refresh our databases folder in our SQL Express instance. Now, it looks like my experience has been that SQL Express is a little slower than the other instances. It's more of a compact instance of SQL Server. But there's our organization bad database. So that's not how to do it. So let's run this, though, in a separate session here. I'm going to create another database called organization again. This time I'm going to create it, let's see, in this grumpy 2019 I2, for instance, 2 instance of SQL Server. Let's refresh it. I only have the test database there. So let me change the folder here. I'm going to go back to our Windows Explorer. I'm going to switch here to instance 2. And I got a whole bunch of stuff oh, I'm sorry, I went to the wrong one. I went to the temp DBI2 instance. Let me go to SQL 2019 data I2. See, it's very easy to make a mistake. I'm going to create a folder called organization. So a little reminder, a little practice, so you can see a technique of how to do these. Double click, copy address as text, and let's go and change this. I'm going to paste the new folder here, and also here, and also here. So this should do it. I got to do a little, remove that extra N. Let's just eyeball this. Is there anything else that I missed? We can highlight this command, and before we execute it, we can check the syntax. So it looks good. All right, so let's go ahead and create this database. Let's double check the connection. I'm going fast here. Change connection. I'm in desktop. No, I'm not. I think I was in the correct one, but let's go to I2. I always double check myself. After all, I'm the grumpy old IT guy. I got to keep checking. All right, let's create this database. Okay, directory lookup for file SQL data I2 organization does not exist. Well, yeah, look at that, typos. Although I did a syntax check, it doesn't really find these little typos. I have those extra N's, so I did not check carefully. Let's try it now. This looks a lot better. Completed real quick. Let's refresh our folder here. And there's our organization database. Okay. Now what do we want to do? Well, we want to look at the parameters here, because we're going to alter this database and add another file group and file. So our file groups, well, the first issue that we have is although we have a second organization data file group, it's not the primary. So let's click it. And then if we look at the files, excuse me, you can see our various files. We have the primary and organization data. Okay, but that's not enough. So let's click on OK. And let's go here. Let's add another file in another file group. Well, how do we do this? Let's use our imagination and make believe that this is a production environment, and we might have users connected to the database, or we might have users that will connect to the database. So the first thing we need to do is to put the database in what's called single user mode. And we use this with the alter database organization set single user. So there it is. We execute it. Let's refresh our database folder again. And we should see the single user words right after the organization name. Okay, so let's start by adding a file group. We'll call it organization data 2. Again, we alter the database. So whenever you do these types of operations, by the way, like setting single user or adding files or file groups, you use the alter database command followed by the database name. And in this case, we add the file group organization underscore data 2. So let's execute it. Let's check the properties. Actually, we don't want to check the properties now because they'll probably get blocked because we're already connected in this session. So it's not going to let me connect again. So now we'll alter the database organization. We'll add another file to the organization data 2 file group we just created. So notice at the bottom here, the 2 file group, all right? And there's the familiar parameters. Again, I'm not going to go through them, but I neglected something. I need to copy this path and replace this path. So now everything is going to go in that nice organization folder under SQL 2019 data I2. So let's proceed and alter the database. We can execute these 2 commands, by the way, at the same time, adding the file group in the file. So let's click it. This might not take too long, but I gave it, so check it out. File group organization data 2 already exists. See, that's why I double check. So let's go to our properties. Let's go to our file group. I tricked myself. So I went in and I tried to look at the properties, and I'm going to hang because I'm already connected. So that's what happens when you put the database in single user mode. So I can't look at the properties. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a file group. Oh, we'll add file group 3. How's that? And we'll do file group 3. Let's try it again. Logical file name organization data 2 already exists. So I keep hanging myself up. Let's add this, make it 3. So by the way, these errors are not on purpose. I'm actually making them. But you can see how SQL Server will give you error messages and how you can go ahead and fix them. Now typically, when you create a database, you do a lot of analysis up front. You make sure all of the names are correct. So I'm doing this live just to show you how to do it. So 3rd time's the charm. Let's see if this works. No, it already exists. So I have a problem here. Let me go put this database in multi-user mode so I can look at the properties. Something's wrong here. Am I in the wrong database? Okay, let's refresh. Okay, I'm back in multi-user mode. Let's look at these properties. Let's look at the file groups. Yes. Yes, I have three file groups. All right, and let's look at my files. I have a whole bunch of files here. I didn't pay attention to any of this, did I? Let us make this 4. And we'll make this file 4. There was no 4s there. Data 4. Okay. This is live, folks. Let's go back to single user mode. This way no one can connect to the database. Let's add file group 4. All right, that worked. 25th time is the charm. Let's add this file group, mistake here, to file group 4. Here we go. That worked. And finally, let's go back to multi-user mode. All right, well, a lot of little bugs here. Well, not bugs, mistakes at my end. Now let's check on the properties. So here we go, file groups, whole bunch of file groups. 2, 3, 4, we don't have a file in file group 4. So we can remedy this right away. Let's copy and paste this. And let's add a file. So I believe it was 3. Let's go back and look. Properties one more time. I have the third file group, which has no files, and the file names I have are organization data, organization 2 and 4, so I don't have a 3. Okay, so this one should now work. Okay, so I'm going to make this a 3. I will make this a 3, and let's see if we're in good shape here. So it looks like it's cranking, it's working. 1,000 kilobytes, okay. Let's look at the properties one more time. So now each file group has a file, and there's all of my files. So you can see how easy it is to make a mistake. So let's refresh our databases folder. And our organization was back in multi-user mode. So that's it. So that's how you create a database with TSQL, and also how to make a whole bunch of mistakes. So let's go back to our clip. Okay, let's see how to drop a database. Now there's 2 methods that we can use to drop a database. Like when we created databases, we can use tools available in Object Explorer, or we can use TSQL. Now remember, Object Explorer is part of that SQL Server Management Studio application we've been using, and we did cover how to navigate through SSMS in my first podcast. So all you need to do is right-click on the database in question that you want to delete and select Delete. All right, so this is what you get. You get a nice little panel here that lets you check everything out, make sure you're in the right database, and you also need to close connections. Right, so there's a little checkbox over there that you can navigate to. There it is, just check on it and it'll close the existing connections. And then click OK when you're sure. So that's all that there is to it. Alternately, if you want to use TSQL, all right, you can use these commands. Now, the actual drop database command is simple. There it is, it's at the bottom. Drop database if exists, test in this case. But you want to first make sure there's no one connected. So you run a command called sp_who2, and that'll show you all of the connections to your database and other databases on your instance of SQL Server. Now, I'm going to show you how to do that. If you do see an instance, if you do see a user connected to your instance to this particular database, you can kill it by typing the word kill and then the process ID, the SPID. I'll show you that too. Then you can alter the database, set it to single user mode, make sure no one tries to connect while you're in the process of dropping the database. And then you just drop the database if exists with that command. All right, that's all that there's to it. So dropping a database with TSQL is quick, it's easy, but make sure no one is connected. All right, so let's go to our demo and let's see how to drop a database with SSMS And I'm going to sneak in TSQL also. All right, let's bring up SQL Server Management Studio. And we've got two databases that we created in our little podcast, two test databases that we really don't need. So let's start by deleting the test database in that SQL Express instance. So real easy, we'll right click on test and we will click on delete. Here comes the panel, right? There's the name of the database, double check everything. And there's the owner, the status of the database is blank, it's running. So we just need to click on this close existing connections, and we don't need this delete backup and restore history. There isn't any, but I'm just going to uncheck it. So I'm just going to click OK. And it's gone. I don't even have to refresh the database folder. It's gone. Now, how about this database down here in my grumpy 2019 I2 instance? I want to delete that. So I want to make sure that I'm in a separate session here, but on the same instance. So let me look at the connections. What am I connected to? I'll just say change connection. And I am in that I2, so that's fine. I'll just click on OK. All right. Now, I want to do an SP-who-to. Here's that command I promised you to look at. I execute SP-who-to, and it should crank and show me who's connected to this database. So let's expand it. I want to look at the DB name, and I don't see test connected here. I don't see any connections to test, that is. Right? This nice SP2 command, by the way, shows you a lot of information, like the host name, the login, the command that's being run, a whole bunch of statistics like CPU time and disk I/O. Real important one is this block by column. It'll show you if there's any processes that are blocking each other. So at first glance, it looks like we can just go ahead and put this database in single user mode. Looks like it ran okay. Let's refresh the database folder. There we are in single user mode. Okay. Let's try dropping the database. Hopefully there's nothing connected like an internal system process. Let's drop the database, and that's it. Looks like it worked. Let's refresh the database folder, and it's gone. So there it is. You've now seen two ways of dropping a database in SQL Server. One using Object Explorer in SSMS, and another one in running a couple of simple queries where you do an SP-who-to to check who's connected. You put the database in single user mode, and then you drop it. So that's it. So let's just go in and wrap things up. All right, we made it through some demos. Congratulations. So let's wrap things up then. What did we learn? We learned that DDL stands for Data Declaration Language, which is a subset of TSQL. And we learned that TSQL stands for Transact SQL. And in this podcast, we looked at how to create and drop databases with SSMS and also with TSQL. Now, we only touched the surface of DDL, but at least you know the basics now. Now we need to put something in the database, and that's what's going to be the topic of our next podcast. We'll learn how to create tables and populate them. Well, I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and hope you learned the basics of creating and dropping a database. Just a little checkpoint. We're in the second podcast of my 9 podcast series on TSQL. But there's also another series of podcasts called Tool Podcasts. And there they are on the clip. There's a podcast T01, Installing SQL Server 2019, where you learn how to download and install SQL Server 2019. Basically, you need that before you can do anything. And there's also podcast T02, Installing SSMS. All right, so that's a pretty good podcast. And then there's podcast T03, Installing Data Tools. Now, data tools will be installed in Visual Studio 2019. So if you don't have Visual Studio 2019, well, go to Podcast T04. And that's installing Visual Studio 2019 Community. It's a free version of Visual Studio. And by the way, data tools will allow you to manage and create SQL Server-based projects in Visual Studio. So these two kind of go together. If you don't have Visual Studio 2019, look at that podcast first. Then there's Podcast T05, installing reporting services. Now, reporting services is Microsoft SQL Server's premier web-based reporting architecture that complements the whole SQL Server BI stack. So you can create reports and dashboards and scorecards based on SQL Server database data, and also other sources of data like spreadsheets and cubes and even text files or other non-Microsoft database products. As long as you have an ODBC driver and you can connect to it, you can create reports in reporting services. Then Podcast T06, installing Report Builder. Well, that's Microsoft's report building tool. So you can design in a real nice, simple GUI front end, reports and scorecards and dashboards. And I call it a simple front end because it's very easy to use, but it's very powerful. And once you create these reports and scorecards, you can publish them to reporting services. And last but not least, there's installing Power BI, which is a very advanced analytical and I'll call it a statistical tool that you can create very advanced, dashboards and scorecards that will complement reporting services, or I should say Report Builder. And it's very heavy on graphics, so you can create dashboards with pie charts and bar charts and all sorts of interesting types of graphics, okay? So please take a look at these podcasts if you haven't, and make sure you have all of these tools installed. Okay, this really wraps it up. So now you know all about creating and dropping databases. You know what tool podcasts are available in my series. And now we'll look at the next podcast, which is creating tables. And by the way, here's the list of all the podcasts in this series. So you should already have taken Navigating SSMS and Creating Databases, this podcast, the first two podcasts. The next one is Creating Tables, and we'll also populate them. Then in podcast 04, there's creating something called views, all right? So views look and behave like tables, but they don't really store any data, except in one specific case where you have a view that's schema-bound. And yeah, I know you don't know what any of that means, but when you look at podcast 04, you will. Now, podcast 05, TSQL DML, Transact SQL Data Manipulation Language, shows you how to write powerful queries against database tables, and also how to populate them, update the data in rows, and also delete data in rows. Then podcast 6 and 7 show you how to use built-in string and date functions in your query. So that's really interesting. A lot of interesting string and date manipulation. For example, you can not only print dates in a query, get the dates, but you can perform mathematics on dates, like find out the difference between two dates. And then podcast 08, the order by clause, shows you how to add the order by clause, in a TSQL query. That's what sorts the returned data once you execute the query. And lastly, there's podcast 09, all right? That's the group by clause that shows you how to group data returned in a query. But now, what do I mean by that? Well, here's an example of a group. Show me all sales by customer date, by customer, and by product. That's a grouping. So by using the group by clause, you can do things like perform summation on the sales amount, right? So you can show, sales by date or by groups of customers and products or any permutation thereof. So I really hope you also look at those. Now here's a little grumpy comment. As I said, my next podcast is creating tables. So please make sure you try to follow this sequence and not jump around. And here's a little shameless advertising alert on my part. Please be on the lookout this fall for my Grumpy University at grumpyolditguy.com. And this is where I offer a buffet, yes, a buffet of TSQL courses to enhance your skills. Now, Grumpy University is not free, it's subscription based, but it'll be really, really, really cheap and cost effective. So I hope you consider checking it out. All right, see you in my next podcast.